The private elevator slid open onto the penthouse floor with a chime far too gentle for the destruction about to unfold. Liam Ashford adjusted the leather portfolio under his arm, the one stuffed with island resort brochures and villa rentals he'd spent the afternoon narrowing down. Amalfi, Santorini, a quiet stretch of coast in Portugal his fiancé had once mentioned loving. He'd been careful with the choices, the way he was careful with everything. When you were about to marry into one of the most powerful families in the city, small details had a way of becoming large ones. His father had taught him that. Gregor Ashford had built an empire on attention to detail, on understanding that the smallest oversight could topple the largest fortune. Liam had learned that lesson well, had internalized it until it became part of his very bones. The folder in his arms contained months of planning, hours of research, countless conversations with wedding planners and travel agents. Every destination had been vetted for security, for discretion, for the kind of exclusivity that his future position demanded. His Oxfords whispered across the imported stone as he approached the door. He'd messaged an hour ago that he was on his way, but Julian hadn't answered. That was hardly strange. Julian Voss was a busy man, forever managing the family's development projects and private funds. Also, he told Liam, the preparations for the wedding had become all-consuming. There were caterers to coordinate, guest lists to finalize, a venue that needed to be transformed into something worthy of the union between two of the city's most powerful families. Julian had been distracted lately, distant in a way that Liam had attributed to stress. He'd been understanding, patient, the perfect fiancé who supported his partner through difficult times. He'd made excuses for Julian's absences, explained away his coldness, rationalized every moment of neglect. Love made you blind, his father had once warned him. Liam had thought he was too smart for that kind of foolishness. He'd been wrong. Liam let himself in with the key Julian had pressed into his palm 4 months earlier, sealed with a kiss and a promise that his home was Liam's now too. The lock gave way soundlessly, and he pushed the door open, calling into the quiet. "Jules, I brought the travel folder. The planner wants our deposit choice by tomorrow." Nothing answered. The apartment spread out ahead of him, all glass walls and severe furniture that likely cost more than most people made in a year. The city burned beyond the windows, 1,000 lights strung across the dark like scattered coins on black water. This view would be his soon. This life. This future. His father had arranged it before the illness hollowed him out and took him 10 months ago. Gregor Ashford had built something from nothing. Legitimate freight companies that owned half the harbor traffic. Cold storage warehouses that moved fortunes in goods. A web of logistics that made him necessary to businesses both above the law and beneath it. On his deathbed, he'd made Liam swear to keep it all standing. "The Voss family is strong," he'd rasped, his once broad hands thin and papery in Liam's. "Julian is hungry. Clever. This marriage protects everything. You'll be safe, son. The company will be safe." Liam agreed because refusing would have shattered his father in his final weeks. He agreed because at 29, he understood that love was a luxury men in his position couldn't always afford. He'd agreed because Julian had seemed flawless, handsome, warm, attentive in every way that mattered. The perfect alpha, or so Liam had believed. The perfect match for an Omega who needed protection, who needed strength, who needed someone to help him navigate the treacherous waters his father had left him to sail alone. Now, standing in his fiancée's silent apartment with the travel folder growing heavy against his ribs, Liam felt the first cold thread of dread. He set the portfolio on the marble island and moved deeper inside. The living room sat empty. His study door hung ajar, the room dark past it. That left the bedroom. The dread sharpened into something with edges. His father had taught him many things before the end. How to read a ledger, how to negotiate with men who mistook his youth for weakness, how to recognize when something was wrong even when everything looked right. Something was wrong. The air in the apartment felt different, charged with something he couldn't name. The scent of unfamiliar cologne mingled with Julian's usual fragrance. 2 glasses sat on the coffee table, one with a faint lip print that wasn't his. A jacket draped over the back of the sofa that he'd never seen before. He should have turned around. Should have called out again, given him warning, preserved whatever illusion he was about to break. But Liam had never been skilled at lying to himself, and some part of him, the part that had catalogued Julian's growing distance, his late nights, the calls that ended the instant Liam entered a room, the way he'd stopped touching Liam with any real warmth, the way his scent had changed when he thought Liam wasn't paying attention, already knew what waited behind that door. It was closed but unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, silently. The scene was almost tediously predictable. Julian's bed, the bed where he'd proposed with Liam's grandmother's ring, where he'd promised him forever, currently held 2 people. Neither had noticed him. Julian's back was to the door, his frame blocking the view of the man beneath him. Then he shifted, and Liam saw a fall of copper hair spilled across the pillow. He knew that hair. He'd known it since childhood. The man laughed, and the sound landed like a blade between Liam's ribs. Derek, his oldest friend since the age of 7. The man who'd hugged him fiercely at the engagement party and volunteered to be best man. The man who'd held his hand at his father's funeral and promised to always be there for him. The man who'd been his confidant, his support, his rock through the darkest days of his life. They'd grown up together, shared secrets and dreams, promised each other that nothing would ever come between them. Liam had trusted Derek with everything. His fears about the marriage, his doubts about Julian, his grief over his father's death. And all along, Derek had been sleeping with the man Liam was supposed to marry. Liam's hand found his phone. His fingers moved with mechanical certainty, unlocking it, opening the camera, tapping record. He angled it to catch everything, his hands steady even as his heart froze solid in his chest. He didn't cry. There'd be time for tears later, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the man who'd agreed to this arranged marriage, who'd folded away his own dreams to honor a dying man's wish, had always known that love was never part of the contract. He'd known it in his bones, had felt it in the way Julian's touch never quite reached his skin, in the way his fiancé's eyes never really saw him. He'd just chosen to ignore it, because ignoring it was easier than facing the truth. Now he had no choice but to face it. But what came next stopped his breathing entirely. When are you going to tell him? Derek's voice drifted, lazy and satisfied, across the room. Julian rolled onto his back, pulling Derek into the curve of his arm. Tell Liam? Why would I? Because you're actually going through with the wedding. Derek traced idle shapes on Julian's chest. You're really going to marry him while you're doing this with me? The wedding was never about Liam. Julian's voice carried a chill Liam had never heard from him. It's about control of Ashford Freight. His old man was smart enough to lock the company in trusts and conditions. Liam marries me, or the whole thing slides to some second cousin. Once we're married, once I've got legal authority over the operation, you get the harbor access you've been begging for. Just like your grandfather wanted. Admiration warmed Derek's tone. Forget what my grandfather wanted. The venom in Julian's voice made Liam's grip tighten on the phone. Constantine Reyes sits on his throne, convinced he owns this city. Convinced the Voss family has to kneel because he runs the table. He's a fossil, Derek. A dinosaur who doesn't get that the real power isn't in product or muscle anymore. It's in clean business. Freight. Logistics. Owning the roads, everything travels on. Once I have Ashford, I'll have something Constantine needs. And then I make myself the man every family in this city can't move a single crate without. I build alliances. And when I've proven I'm worth more than that old ghost. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Derek laughed softly. You're going to kill him. You're going to kill Constantine Reyes. The table needs new leadership. Someone who understands we're businessmen now, not thugs. Someone who can carry us into the future. That's me. And poor Liam never sees any of it. He's the beautiful wife. The perfect cover. He's so desperate to honor Daddy that he'll do whatever I tell him. And me? Derek's voice curdled into a pout. Do I have to watch you play house with him? Just until I consolidate. Once I control the table, once Constantine's gone, we do whatever we want. I divorce him or keep him silent. I don't care. You'll be beside me where you belong. The recording had run 3 minutes. Liam had everything he needed. He backed from the doorway with the same careful silence he'd used to approach it. His movements were automatic, his mind eerily calm. Shock, perhaps. Or perhaps simply the moment when every illusion he'd built around this marriage finally collapsed, leaving nothing but clarity behind. He reached the kitchen, retrieved the travel folder with hands that still refused to tremble, and let himself out. The elevator seemed to take a century. Liam watched the numbers fall, 51, 50, 49, and tried to process it. His fiancé was betraying him with the man he'd trusted longest. That wounded, but it was almost the smaller injury. Julian had never wanted him. He'd wanted his father's company. He was marrying him to steal an empire and use it to murder the deadliest man in the city. The elevator opened onto the parking level. Liam walked to his car, a low black coupe that had been his father's and still smelled faintly of his cedar cologne. He set the folder on the passenger seat, then simply sat, staring at the concrete wall. The silence of the garage pressed in around him, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional echo of tires on concrete. He sat there for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The betrayal was a physical weight in his chest, crushing and cold. He'd given Julian everything. His trust, his future, his father's legacy. And Julian had seen it all as nothing more than a means to an end. This was the moment to call someone. His lawyer. His father's oldest confidant, Nathaniel Brandt, who'd counseled him against this marriage. Even the police. Though what would he tell them? That his fiancée planned a murder based on a conversation he'd recorded without consent? No. The police were useless against people like the Voss family. People like Constantine Reyes. They lived in a world where ordinary law never reached, where power and violence wrote their own statutes. Liam had grown up in the shadow of that world, had been protected from its darkest corners by his father's careful neutrality. But he'd always known it was there, always understood that the sleek offices and legitimate contracts of Ashford Freight rested on a foundation of connections to men who operated outside the law. Liam pulled out his phone and played the recording again. Julian's voice filled the quiet car. Once I have Ashford, I'll have something Constantine needs. You're going to kill Constantine Reyes. He's the beautiful wife. The perfect cover. He watched it 3 times. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled until he found a name he'd never dreamed of using. Constantine Reyes. His father had known him. Of course he had. You couldn't own half the harbor traffic without dealing with the man who ran the city's underworld. Gregor Ashford had kept a scrupulous neutrality, moving cargo for every family without choosing sides. It had kept him alive, kept his business thriving, kept Liam insulated from the darker machinery of his work. But Gregor had also made certain his son knew how to reach certain people. Just in case. If anything ever happens to me, he told Liam once. And you need real help, not the kind lawyers can give. He'd handed him a short list of numbers. Constantine Reyes sat at the top. Liam stared at the contact for a long moment. Then he looked at the travel folder on the seat beside him. At the honeymoon, he'd been designing for a marriage that had never been real. Julian thought he was soft, gullible, so desperate to honor his father that he'd let himself be used. He thought he knew every rule of the game, and Liam knew none. He was wrong. Liam opened a new message to Constantine's number. His thumbs moved fast. We need to talk. Your grandson is planning to kill you. He hit send before he could reconsider. Then he started the car and drove. Not home to the apartment his father had left him. Not to Derek's place where his friend was probably still tangled in Julian's sheets. Certainly not back upstairs to confront them both. He drove to his father's favorite overlook. High in the hills where the whole city unrolled below. The harbor, the freight yards, the bridges and rivers of light that stood for everything Gregor Ashford had built. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered to the empty car. But I'm not going to protect your legacy by marrying a man who wants to use it to commit murder. I'll protect it my way. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. Tomorrow night. 10. The Cardinal Room. Come alone. Liam recognized the text for what it was. The Cardinal Room was Constantine Reyes's territory, the private establishment where he did business far from watching eyes. Walking in alone, a man who'd just accused his grandson of treason took either courage or stupidity. He typed back, "I'll be there." Another message, "Bring proof." Liam looked at the video, 3 minutes of Julian and Derek trading betrayal and murder. 3 minutes that would either get him killed or hand him the power to destroy the man who tried to destroy him. "I have it," he replied. The city glittered below, beautiful and lethal. Somewhere down there, Julian was probably still in bed, both of them laughing at how easily they'd played him. Let them laugh. Let them enjoy their last hours of certainty. Because Liam Ashford had just learned something. He'd spent his whole life being the good son, the lovely heir, the perfect partner. He'd learned to conceal his own ambitions, to lower his voice, to make himself appear unthreatening, an omega who would never challenge any alpha's pride. He'd shrunk himself to fit other people's ambitions. That man had died tonight in Julian's apartment. The man sitting in this car, watching the city that men like his father and Constantine Reyes had raised on blood and money, was someone new. Someone who understood that in this world, you either wrote the rules or became their casualty. Julian had made his choice. Now Liam would make his. The next day passed in a careful performance. Liam ran his company as usual, contracts, department heads, absolute normalcy on the surface. He attended meetings, approved budgets, signed off on shipping manifests. His staff noticed nothing unusual. His assistant complimented him on his composure, remarked that he seemed more focused than usual. Liam smiled and thanked him, the smile never reaching his eyes. Beneath the surface, he gathered intelligence, mapping exactly which shipments moved through his docks for which houses, learning the full shape of Ashford Freight's connections to the city's underworld. Knowledge was power, and if he was going to be Constantine's ally, he needed to understand precisely what he brought to the table. He spent hours reviewing files his father had left behind, documents that detailed the delicate balance of power between the 5 families, the web of alliances and rivalries that kept the city's underworld in check. He studied shipping manifests, cross-referenced them with known associates of each house, built a mental map of who owed what to whom. The Ashford docks were neutral ground, a fact that had kept his father alive and prosperous for decades. But neutrality meant something different when you were the one making the rules. Liam began to see the possibilities that his father had chosen to ignore, the ways Ashford Freight could be used not just as a neutral conduit, but as a source of power in its own right. He started making notes, sketching out strategies, thinking about leverage and alliances in ways he'd never allowed himself before. By the time his assistant knocked on his door, he'd learned more about the city's true power structure than most people would discover in a lifetime. His assistant knocked at noon. "Mr. Ashford?" "Mr. Brandt is here." Nathaniel Brandt, his father's oldest friend and the company's general counsel. Liam's stomach tightened. "Send him in." Brandt entered looking grave, his silver hair immaculate. He'd been present at every milestone of Liam's life. "Liam," he said, taking the chair across from the desk without waiting. "We need to talk about the Voss marriage. I've heard concerning things. Nothing concrete, but enough to worry me. Have you actually investigated the man you're about to marry?" It was almost funny. If he only knew. "I appreciate the concern, Nathaniel, but everything's fine with Julian." The lie came easier than it should have. Liam hated lying to Brandt, who'd been like an uncle to him, who'd guided him through the fog of grief after his father's death. But the truth would only put Brandt in danger. The fewer people who knew about Liam's plans, the safer everyone would be. "Is it? You look exhausted. And I know that expression. It's the one your father wore when he was carrying something he couldn't tell me." Liam considered him carefully. Brandt had been his father's consigliere in everything but name. The man who built the legal scaffolding that kept Ashford operating in gray areas without ever quite crossing into the obvious. He'd know the city's power dynamics better than almost anyone. Nathaniel, hypothetically, if someone wanted to make an alliance with one of the 5 houses, how would they do it? Brant went very still. Hypothetically. He paused. They'd be very careful. Alliances in that world aren't contracts. They're bonds enforced by reputation and violence. Once you're tied to one house, the others see you as committed. His voice sharpened. Liam, what's going on? This doesn't sound hypothetical. Liam wanted to tell him, to share the weight of it. But Constantine's words echoed, absolute commitment. The moment anyone suspected, Julian might move his timeline up. Nothing's going on. I'm just trying to understand the landscape. Dad navigated these waters for years. I need to learn how. Brant didn't look convinced, but he let it go. Your father managed it through strict neutrality. Served every house equally. Took no sides. It kept him safe, but limited his power. He stood. Whatever you're considering, please be careful. Gregor built this company to provide for you, not to be a weapon in someone else's war. After he left, Liam sat in the quiet, staring at his father's photograph. I'm being careful, Dad, he whispered. Just in a different way than you were. At 6, he went home to change for dinner. He chose a suit Julian liked, elegant, understated. He styled his short dark hair precisely, the way Julian preferred. He wore the cologne Julian had given him. He looked like the perfect fiancé, the man who no longer existed. Julian was waiting at the restaurant, handsome in navy, and kissed his cheek. Liam suppressed the urge to flinch. You look beautiful, Julian said warmly. Missed you. The words tasted like ash. They ordered wine, discussed the guest list, the seating. Julian played the devoted fiancé flawlessly. If Liam hadn't heard the recording, he might have believed it. How's work? Julian asked, cutting into his steak. Anything interesting? His opening. Actually, yes. Something concerning. We've had security issues at the harbor. Nothing major yet, but enough that I'm worried about vulnerabilities. The security firm I consulted recommended I attend an industry meeting at the Cardinal Room next week. Apparently, it's where freight companies discuss protecting high-value cargo. Julian's expression showed only mild interest. The Cardinal Room? That's my grandfather's place, isn't it? Is it? I didn't realize. Should I not go? No, it's fine. Constantine keeps his fingers in all sorts of legitimate businesses. Makes sense he'd host industry events. He squeezed Liam's hand. I'm glad you're taking harbor security seriously. He had no idea. No suspicion at all. Liam watched Julian's face as he spoke, searching for any hint that his fiancée knew the truth. There was nothing but pleasant unconcern. Julian had dismissed him completely, written him off as a non-entity, a pawn on the board. When Julian drove him home and kissed him goodnight, Liam played his part until Julian's car vanished around the corner. Only then did he let himself breathe. Back inside, he messaged Constantine, dinner done. He bought the Cardinal Room story completely. Perfect, came the reply. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Same location. We finalized strategy. The next afternoon, Liam left the office early and drove to the club. The same man met him. A tall alpha with sharp eyes and an earpiece. But this time led him not to the penthouse, but to a private conference room. Constantine stood at a large table strewn with photographs and documents. Jacket off, sleeves rolled up. The alpha was even more imposing in person than in the photographs Liam had seen. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Dark hair silvered at the temples, eyes nearly black in the low light. A perfectly cut slate suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who'd built an empire on intelligence and violence, who commanded absolute loyalty, who had outlived nearly everyone who'd started when he did. Liam. Good. A lot to cover. He gestured to the materials. Dossiers on everyone who'll be in that room. You need to know who they are, what they want, how they'll react. Liam moved to the table. Hard faces, most of them. Eyes that had seen violence and ordered more. A few other alphas among them, plus a couple of betas. Tomorrow night, Constantine said. Liam looked up sharply. I thought the table met in 3 days. Change of plans. Julian requested an emergency session. His expression darkened. He has important business for the houses, which means he's accelerating. A chill ran down Liam's spine. Does he know something? No. If he knew about us, he'd have gone to ground. This is something else. He pulled up a photograph of Julian speaking with an older alpha Liam didn't recognize. Our people caught him meeting Silas Merrick yesterday. He's building support. So we're out of time. We adapt. The performance happens tomorrow. Can you be ready? Liam thought of Julian's easy lies, the way he'd kissed him while planning to use him. Yes. They spent the next hours mapping every detail. Where Liam would enter. How he'd move. What he'd say if questioned. Instead of arriving with Julian, he'd come in late after the session started, looking for his fiancé, apologetic for the disruption, and then, instead of going to Julian, he'd cross to Constantine. He'll be furious, Liam said quietly. He'll be destroyed. There's a difference. The moment you choose me over him in front of the table, he loses all credibility. Anything he says afterward sounds like the complaint of a man who couldn't hold his own fiancé. Constantine met his eyes. Then I show them the video. The revelation of treason becomes my moment, not yours. It keeps you a step removed from the violence that follows. He coached Liam on body language, on the signals that conveyed confidence versus submission in his world. When you approach me, don't ask permission. Don't hesitate. Act like you have every right to be there. Because you do. And the kiss? Liam asked. It needs to communicate ownership without desperation. Confidence without arrogance. Can you do that? Yes. The word came out more honest than he'd intended. Something flickered across Constantine's face. You're not afraid of me anymore. Should I be? Most people are. He reached out, his fingers brushing Liam's jaw. But you never really were. Even that first night. You walked in like you owned the place. Fear is useful sometimes. It's also limiting. You're dangerous, Constantine, but you're the only person in this city who's been completely honest with me. Julian lied about loving me. Derek lied about being my friend. You've been exactly what you claimed from the beginning. I can work with honest danger. It's the dishonest kind that destroys you. Constantine studied him a long moment, then stepped back. We should practice the entrance. I want it natural tomorrow, not rehearsed. They ran the scene again and again. Liam walking in, scanning for Julian, his expression shifting from apologetic to determined as he changed course toward Constantine. Each time, it felt more real, less like performance. Finally, Constantine called a break. That's enough. You've got it. Just remember, confidence, not hesitation. Liam sank into a chair, suddenly drained. Second thoughts. No. Just processing. Tomorrow, everything changes. There's no going back after this. No, there isn't. Constantine's voice was quiet. So I'll ask one final time. Are you certain? Because once you walk into that room, you're committed to the alliance. To the consequences. Liam stood and crossed to him. I'm certain. Julian made his choice when he decided to use me. Derek made his. Now I make mine. I choose power over pretense. I choose you over him. Constantine's hand came up to cup Liam's face. Then tomorrow we show them exactly what that choice means. He kissed him, and there was nothing rehearsed about it. This wasn't practice. This was real. Intense. A claiming that had nothing to do with an audience. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Constantine's eyes had darkened. Tomorrow, he said roughly. After the table. After Julian is dealt with. You and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what this alliance actually is. Liam's pulse raced. He was looking forward to it. The next day crawled. At 4, Liam went home to prepare. The suit he chose was perfect. Deep emerald silk that fit like a second skin, elegant but powerful. Black Oxfords that added 3 inches. He applied a touch of concealer to hide the shadows under his eyes. Nothing more. Just enough to look sharp and alert under the lights. His short dark hair was swept back from his face, clean and severe. The effect was stunning. Dangerous. Nothing like the understated look Julian preferred. This man wasn't anyone's lovely fiancé. This man was a king claiming his throne. He spent an hour in front of the mirror, practicing the expressions Constantine had taught him, the subtle shifts in posture that communicated confidence rather than submission. He'd spent his whole life learning to make himself smaller, less threatening, more palatable to the powerful alphas who surrounded him. Tonight, he would be anything but small. At 8:30, his phone buzzed. Car's downstairs. Driver knows where to take you. Confidence, not hesitation. You've got this. Liam took one last look in the mirror, grabbed his clutch, and went down. The town car navigated through evening traffic. His heart hammered. This was the moment that would define everything after. He thought about his father, about his dying wish that Liam would be safe. Gregor had meant well, but his vision of safety had nearly destroyed him. Real safety didn't come from arranged marriages to alphas who saw you as a tool. It came from power, from alliances built on respect, from being someone no one dared betray. The car pulled up at exactly 9. Liam stepped out, head high, radiating the confidence Constantine had drilled into him. He walked through the entrance and rode the private elevator up alone. The doors opened onto a large room he hadn't seen before. At least 40 people filled the space. Alphas in expensive suits, a few betas, all radiating that particular brand of danger. Conversation stopped as heads turned. Liam scanned quickly. There, at the center table, Julian sat beside an older alpha who could only be Silas Merrick. His fiancée looked shocked, confusion flickering across his face. And there, at the head table, Constantine watched him with those dark eyes. No surprise, just a slight nod. Now, Liam moved forward, not toward Julian, not toward the empty seat that had surely been reserved for him beside his fiancée, but straight across the room toward Constantine. His heels clicked in the sudden silence. Liam, Julian's voice cut through. What are you doing here? Liam didn't answer, didn't even look at him. He reached Constantine's table and without hesitation, without asking permission, moved to stand beside him. Constantine's hand came up to rest on his hip, possessive, claiming, utterly confident. Some of you know Liam Ashford, Constantine said calmly, his voice carrying. For those who don't, he controls Ashford Freight and half the harbor traffic in this city. He's also my newest partner. The shock was palpable. Constantine, what the hell is this? Julian was on his feet now, face flushed. Liam is my fiancé. He has no business here. And he certainly isn't your partner. Actually, Liam spoke for the first time, voice steady and clear. I believe I have every right to be here. Ashford Freight does business with every house in this room. It's past time I understood exactly who I'm working with. We're getting married in 3 weeks, Julian snapped. Whatever business you conduct goes through our family. Is that what you think? That once we're married, you'll control my company? Yes. We discussed this. Your father arranged it. My father arranged a marriage to protect his legacy. He never said I had to marry you. Liam let it land. And given what I've learned about your plans, I've decided to decline. The room erupted in whispers. Julian went pale. What plans? Perhaps, Constantine said smoothly. We should show everyone exactly what plans Mr. Ashford means. He gestured, and the screen at the front flickered to life. Liam's video began playing. Julian's voice filled the room, confessing the affair, outlining his scheme, discussing his intention to kill Constantine and seize the throne. The silence was absolute. Liam watched Julian's face shift from confusion to horror to rage. Around the room, the family heads leaned forward, expressions hardening. When it ended, Constantine stood and pulled Liam closer against his side. My grandson planned to murder me and use an alliance with Ashford Freight to position himself as my successor. He violated every code we operate under. He betrayed family, plotted against the table, and tried to manipulate an Omega into being his accomplice. That video is fake, Julian said desperately. He doctored it. He's lying. The metadata says otherwise. We had it verified by 3 independent experts. Constantine looked around the room. But more to the point, does anyone here doubt this is something Julian would do? Has anyone missed his ambition? His resentment? The silence was damning. No one rose to defend him. I move that Julian Voss be stripped of his position within the Voss family and exiled from this city. All in favor. Hands rose. Not all, but enough. Julian's face contorted. You scheming little, you think you've won? You think aligning with him makes you powerful? No, Liam said calmly. I think using you would have made me weak. Choosing my own path makes me powerful. There's a difference. Julian lunged, but Constantine's security was faster. Two alphas materialized from the shadows and seized his arms. You have 24 hours to leave the city, Constantine told him. Take what you can carry. Everything else stays. If you're still here after tomorrow night, the table's judgment becomes permanent. The finality made it clear what permanent meant. Security dragged Julian toward the exit, his protests echoing until the door closed. Constantine turned back to the assembled houses. Now that the unpleasant business is handled, Ashford Freight will work exclusively with the Reyes family going forward. Any goods moving through the harbor come through us. Any arrangements previously made with Julian Voss are void. Liam felt every gaze in the room. This was the moment. He turned to Constantine, and Constantine looked down at him. Then Liam reached up, pulled his head down, and kissed him. The kiss was everything it needed to be. Confident. Possessive. Unmistakable. When they broke apart, the room stayed silent. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Others joined. Applause that was equal parts approval, respect, and acknowledgement of the play they'd just witnessed. Cyrus Merrick was among the first to approach, his weathered face splitting into a grin. Constantine, you sly bastard. I should have known when Julian came to me yesterday. Too eager, too confident. He took Liam's hand. Your father was a good man, Mr. Ashford. He'd be proud of how you handled this. They worked the room for another hour. Liam meeting the power players of the city's underworld, cementing his position. By the time the crowd thinned, his face ached from smiling. Finally, Constantine leaned down. We're leaving. There's someone you need to see. The elevator carried them up in charged silence. When the doors opened, Liam was surprised they weren't alone. Derek sat on the couch, flanked by two of Constantine's people, looking smaller than Liam remembered. Liam, Derek breathed. Thank God. Tell them there's been a mistake. Tell them I didn't know what Julian was planning. Liam walked closer, studying the man who'd shared his childhood, who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral, who'd betrayed him in the worst possible way. You knew, he said quietly. I heard you on the video. You knew he was using me. You knew he planned to kill Constantine. And you didn't care. I loved him. Tears streamed down Derek's face. I thought once he had power, we could be together. I didn't think about what it meant for you. No, you never did think about anyone but yourself. Please. I'm your oldest friend. I'm sorry. Don't let him hurt me. Constantine moved beside Liam. That's not my decision. This is between the two of you. Liam looked at Derek. Really looked. The selfishness that had always been there, the entitlement dressed as charm. He thought about forgiveness. Then he thought about the recording, the complete absence of remorse until consequences arrived. You're going to leave the city, Liam said flatly. Tonight. You'll go somewhere far away and never contact me again. You'll never speak about what happened here. In exchange for your safety, you'll disappear completely. If I ever hear you violated these terms, the protection I'm offering ends. Derek stared, comprehension dawning. You're exiling me, just like Julian. The difference is, I'm giving you a choice about where you go, and enough to start over. That's more mercy than you showed me. For a moment, Derek looked like he might argue. Then he saw the finality in Liam's face, and his shoulders slumped. Okay, he whispered. I'll go. Constantine gestured to his people. They escorted Derek out, his sobs fading until the door closed. Then they were alone. Liam walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the city lights. He'd just exiled his oldest friend, ended his engagement, publicly aligned himself with the city's most powerful crime boss. And somehow, in the quiet aftermath, He felt lighter than he had in months. Are you all right? Constantine's voice came from behind him, closer than expected. I don't know. I should feel something, shouldn't I? Guilt. Regret. Something other than relief. Relief is normal. You just cut away the parts of your life that were poisoning you. That takes strength most people never find. All ruthlessness. Liam met his eyes in the glass. What does that make me? Decisive. Someone who understands that mercy to the cruel is cruelty to the innocent. Derek could have warned you, protected you, chosen you over him. He didn't. Why should you sacrifice yourself to protect him now? Because I once loved him. Liam's voice cracked slightly. Love that isn't returned is just self-destruction with a prettier name. Constantine turned him to face him, cupping his face with surprising gentleness. Your father wanted you safe and happy. Do you think watching Derek destroy you would have made him proud? No, Liam whispered. But he never wanted me to become this. Someone who exiles the people he loved and kisses crime bosses in front of rooms full of criminals. And yet you did both tonight with perfect composure. So the question isn't whether your father would approve. It's whether you do. Whether you can live with the man you're becoming. Liam considered it carefully. The man he'd been a week ago would never have recorded his fiancée's betrayal. Never walked into the cardinal room alone. But that man had also been miserable. Trapped. Invisible. Safe, perhaps. Also voiceless. I can live with him, Liam said finally. The one who fights back. And makes hard choices. And refuses to be used. I can live with him just fine. Good. Because he's magnificent. The compliment sent warmth through his chest. Before he could second-guess himself, he closed the distance and kissed Constantine. Not for an audience this time. Just because he wanted to. Constantine responded immediately, his arms coming around Liam's waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Constantine rested his forehead against Liam's. We should talk about what happens now. What happened tonight in front of the table changes things. Every house in this city now sees you as mine. That's not a performance we can stop when the audience leaves. I know. I knew that when I walked into that room. There are consequences you haven't considered. Competitors who'll see you as a target. Law enforcement that will look harder at your company. A life considerably more dangerous than anything you've known. You're trying to scare me. Why? Having second thoughts. No. I'm making sure you understand what you've committed to. Constantine's voice softened. You impressed me tonight. The way you handled Julian, the table, even your friend. But perfection under pressure and living this life long-term are different things. So what are you suggesting? That I back out. I'm suggesting we establish clear terms. Business partnership, obviously. But the personal part. What's been building between us? That needs definition too. Liam used the moment Constantine handed him a drink to gather his thoughts. He was right. Chemistry wasn't a foundation for the kind of partnership they were building. What do you want it to be? He asked honestly. I want you. Have since you walked into my club with nothing but evidence and audacity. But I respect you too much to complicate a good arrangement with unclear expectations. So we keep it professional. Is that what you want? Liam looked at him. The smart choice was obvious. Clean boundaries, uncomplicated alliance. But Liam was tired of making the smart choice when it meant denying what he actually wanted. No, he said firmly. I don't want to keep it professional. I want to explore whatever this is. Carefully. With clear expectations. But I won't pretend there's nothing here when we both know there is. Constantine's smile was slow and satisfied. Then we moved forward together. Partners in every sense. But promise me, if this ever stops working, business or personal, you tell me immediately. No suffering in silence. We're equals. That means honesty always. I can agree to that. Same goes for you. Deal. He pulled Liam back into his arms, and this time the kiss felt like sealing more than an arrangement. Stay tonight, Constantine murmured. Not because of the alliance. Just because I want you here. Liam's heart raced. This was a line they couldn't uncross. But then again, everything had already changed. Okay, he whispered. I'll stay. The following months passed in a whirlwind. Liam moved into Constantine's penthouse, and true to his word, Constantine let him reshape it into a space that reflected both their tastes. They spent weekends together, the Alpha teaching him the intricacies of his world, the Omega showing him the delicate machinery of Ashford Freight. They argued about business decisions, debated strategies, pushed each other to be better. Constantine never treated him as fragile, never assumed he needed protection from the harsh realities of their world. Instead, he taught Liam to navigate them, to see threats before they materialized, to build alliances that would outlast any single opponent. Liam threw himself into the table's work, quickly establishing himself as a voice for strategic reform and legitimate expansion. He learned the rhythms of the organization, the unspoken rules that governed the interactions between houses, the delicate balance of power that kept the city from tearing itself apart. Not long after, he got the news he'd half expected. Julian had left the city. Derek had boarded a flight to Lisbon around the same time. Both gone. The relief was profound. Liam woke one morning and realized he hadn't thought about Julian in days. The betrayal that had once consumed him had faded to a distant memory, overshadowed by the life he was building with Constantine. He didn't forgive Julian. Exactly. Some wounds were too deep for forgiveness, but he no longer felt the sharp sting of betrayal when he thought of him. The man who tried to destroy him had become irrelevant, a footnote in a story that had moved on to more important things. Liam found himself thinking instead about the future, about the empire he and Constantine were building together, about the legacy they would leave behind. The other houses tested the partnership, as Constantine had warned. Cyrus Merrick indeed tried over a carefully staged lunch to poach him away with generous terms. Liam declined politely and firmly, exactly as he'd been coached. "I'm flattered by your interest, Mr. Merrick," he said, his voice calm and measured. "But I've made my choice. Constantine and I have built something that works for both of us. I have no interest in disrupting that." Merrick had smiled, impressed by his loyalty. Constantine, to his surprise, encouraged him to build his own network. "Relying entirely on me makes you vulnerable. If anything happens to our alliance, the stronger you are independently, the stronger we are together." The Alpha's wisdom surprised him sometimes, the way he thought in terms of years and decades rather than moments. He was building something that would outlast them both, a foundation for future generations. Nathaniel Brandt eventually learned the full scope of his involvement and, after considerable deliberation, agreed to support him. "Your father operated in gray areas too. You're just more honest about it." Brandt had been skeptical at first, worried that Liam was trading one kind of dependency for another. But over time, he'd seen the way Constantine treated his young partner, not as a possession to be controlled, but as an equal to be respected. He'd seen the way Liam had grown, the way he carried himself with a confidence that had been absent during his engagement to Julian. "I was wrong about Constantine," Brandt admitted one afternoon. "I thought he was just another crime boss, another alpha looking to take advantage. But he sees you, really sees you. That's rare in any world." Liam smiled at that, thinking about all the ways Constantine had proven Brandt wrong. Liam brought a proposal to the table that transformed everything. A pivot away from the traditional criminal operations toward legitimate ventures, pharmaceutical imports, medical supply distribution, gaming licenses, real estate. The revenue dwarfed what the houses had made the old way. The old guard resisted, but profit spoke louder than tradition. Constantine supported him publicly, but privately he admitted he'd been skeptical. "I didn't think it would work," he confessed one night, his arms wrapped around Liam in their bed. "But you saw something I didn't. You saw a future that didn't require blood to sustain itself." Liam smiled against his chest. "That's what happens when you let an Omega think for himself." Constantine laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. They lay there in the darkness, discussing their plans for the city, their dreams for the future. It felt like a new beginning, the first chapter of a story that would be written entirely on their own terms. At the meeting where the table voted to offer him a permanent seat, the first Omega in its history to hold one, it was the eldest member, Domenico Falcone, who tested him hardest. Constantine, you're going to tell me he's not just an extension of Rhea's interests? Constantine started to respond, but Liam spoke first. With respect, Mr. Falcone, Constantine doesn't speak for me. I speak for myself. There will be votes where we disagree. When that happens, I'll vote my conscience and my business interests, not his preferences. I'm not asking to join as anyone's puppet. If that's unacceptable, vote no now and save us the trouble of discovering it later. The room went silent. Then Falcone began to laugh. Took me 3 years to talk to Constantine that way. You did it in your first year. He nodded slowly. You've got steel. I vote yes. The vote passed unanimously. His relationship with Constantine deepened alongside his power. It was the quiet moments Liam treasured most, cooking breakfast together, laughing at his terrible attempt to flip an egg, standing at the window with Constantine's arms around him, discussing their plans for the city. They built a life together, brick by brick, each moment strengthening the foundation they'd laid on that first explosive night. Constantine was different than Liam had expected. Underneath the ruthlessness was a man who'd been hurt too, who understood betrayal and loss, who'd built walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. Liam had broken through those walls, and what he'd found was worth every risk. They shared a bond that went beyond the strategic alliance they'd started with. It was something deeper, something neither of them had been looking for, but both had desperately needed. Roughly a year after that first night at the Cardinal Room, Domenico Falcone raised a glass at a private dinner. Your father and I had our differences, but I respected him. He'd approve of this. You found someone who sees your worth. Constantine squeezed Liam's hand under the table, and Liam felt a warmth spread through his chest. He thought about his father often, wondered what Gregor would have made of the path he'd chosen. Would he have been horrified by his son's alliance with the city's underworld? Or would he have been proud of the way Liam had taken control of his own destiny? He liked to think it was the latter. His father had always wanted him to be strong, to be capable of standing on his own 2 feet. He just hadn't expected the path to strength to lead through the heart of the city's most dangerous organization. Some months later, an unexpected visitor appeared at Liam's office. Derek, looking thin and tired, his old polish dimmed by exile. I know I'm not supposed to be here, he said from the doorway. But I needed to see you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know I understand what I destroyed. I was jealous, Liam. You always mattered to your father in a way I never mattered to anyone. Julian made me feel important. I was stupid enough to choose that over you. Liam felt no satisfaction in his old friend's pain, but no sympathy either. What do you want? Nothing. Just to say I'm sorry, and that you were right to send me away. As Derek turned to leave, Liam stopped him. You can come back to the city, but not into my life. You find your own way. Build your own future, separate from anything I've created. If you can prove you've actually changed, maybe someday. But it starts with respecting the boundaries I'm setting. Tears streamed down Derek's face. Thank you. I won't let you down. You already did. Now you get the chance not to do it again. Don't waste it. After he left, Liam felt Constantine's presence before he saw him. He'd waited in the outer office, giving him privacy. You were generous, Constantine said. I was practical. Keeping him in exile forever serves nothing but vengeance. And I've learned that power held with restraint is more impressive than power spent on cruelty. You've changed since that first night. Grown into someone even more formidable than I imagined. We both have. Constantine turned him to face him and reached into his pocket, drawing out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, an emerald surrounded by diamonds, the green stone matching the suit Liam had worn to that first meeting with the table. I know we started this as strategy, Constantine said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. But somewhere along the way, strategy became love. Marry me. Not for business. Not for the table. Just because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you. Liam stared at the ring, his heart pounding. A year ago, he'd been planning a wedding to an alpha who wanted to use him. Now he was being asked by an alpha who saw him as an equal, who'd helped him claim his power, who loved him for his strength rather than despite it. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The ring fit perfectly, just like they did. They married in a small private ceremony with only the 5 houses in attendance. Liam wore cream silk instead of white, a deliberate choice that signaled this wasn't an innocent first wedding but a partnership between equals. Domenico Falcone officiated. "I've watched a lot of marriages in this business," he said as they exchanged rings. "Most are strategic. Very few are what you two have built. May you continue to be each other's greatest strength." Over the following year, Liam's reforms transformed the table. The old high-risk operations were phased out entirely, replaced by legitimate enterprise. Ashford Freight thrived, expanding into international markets and forming partnerships with respectable corporations worldwide. His dual role created synergies that benefited everyone at the table. The houses that had once been rivals now worked together, their interests aligned by the new economic reality Liam had created. He'd turned the underworld into something resembling a legitimate business community, and while the old guard grumbled about the loss of tradition, they couldn't argue with the results. One evening, nearly 2 years after that first night at the Cardinal Room, Liam stood at the penthouse window watching the sunset paint the city crimson and gold. Constantine joined him, handing him a glass. "Thinking about something?" he asked. "About how different everything is now. 2 years ago, I was planning a wedding to an alpha who wanted to use me, feeling invisible and powerless. Now I'm one of the most powerful people in this city, married to someone who actually loves me, building a legitimate empire out of what used to be something darker." His free hand moved to rest on his stomach, where their child was beginning to grow. Constantine's hand covered his. "Terrified yet?" "Absolutely. But also excited. He'll grow up in a very different world than I did. He'll see his father as powerful, not protected. He'll learn strength from the beginning, not after betrayal forces him to find it." "Do you ever regret it?" Constantine asked quietly. "The choices you made? The world you entered?" Liam considered it carefully. He'd given up the safe life his father had envisioned. He'd become someone his younger self might not recognize. But he'd also become someone who controlled his own destiny, who chose his partner instead of having one chosen for him, who used power to create change instead of being crushed by it. "No," he said finally. "No regrets. This life, this partnership, this future, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Everything I needed to become." Constantine pulled him close, and Liam relaxed into the solid strength of him. They'd started as allies of necessity and become partners in every sense. They'd built something rare in their world, love that coexisted with power, partnership that made both of them stronger. The city lights began to glow as darkness fell. 1,000 points spread out below them like scattered coins on black water. Somewhere out there, people made their choices, played their games, pursued their ambitions. All of them operating in a city that Liam Ashford Reyes now helped shape. He'd turned betrayal into empire, heartbreak into power, vulnerability into strength. He'd learned the rules of the game and then rewritten them to suit himself. He'd become the most dangerous Omega in the city, not through violence, but through intelligence, patience, and the courage to claim what was his. The man who'd carried a honeymoon folder up to his fiancé's apartment 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true power came from choosing your own path, that real strength was built on honesty, and that the best revenge was becoming so powerful betrayal could never touch you again. Liam Ashford had been invisible, overlooked, underestimated. Liam Ashford Reyes was a force to be reckoned with, a king who'd claimed his throne and would defend it with everything he had. And he was just getting started.